Story 1. Whenever we had family dinners, my sibling and I, until we were about 13 years old, were told to sit under the dinner table while the adults ate. We were only allowed back out after my grandfather knocked on the table 3 times in a row. Story 2. We had a highway in our backyard, and whenever there was an accident, my father would grab a flashlight and we would go to investigate. One time there was a motorcycle accident and I saw the helmet. Then I saw the body, but it had no head. It was in the helmet. I was about 10 years old. Obviously, at 63, I still never forget it. Story 3. My mother is obsessed with puppies, kittens, and babies to an extent. As a child, it was normal for us to have 2 or 3 dogs and cats at once. Being the oldest child, I was expected to look after and train them. Then, every year or so, she would wait for my sister and me to go to school and sell the dogs and cats to someone else. A new puppy or kitten would be there when we got home, and if we ever mentioned the other animals, she would say, "This is your dog or cat now, talk about this one." Then the whole cycle would start again. I was particularly attached to the dogs and always wondered what happened to them. I didn't realize this was so harmful to me until she did it again last month and wanted my young son to be excited about her new puppy. I surprised myself with the strength of my response. She is still avoiding speaking to me, and I am not upset about it. Story 4. As a child, I would call the local bar, ask for my father, and then request that he come home. I thought I was being helpful by expressing how much I missed him, but in reality, I was used to guilt him into returning. Story 5. I used to tear strips of paper off old paperback books when I was very hungry and there was nothing to eat in the house. Story 6. The moldy fridge, constant clutter, leaking roof, and decaying floor didn't faze me as a child. But looking back, it was bad. Story 7. My mother had breast cancer when I was young, and I thought it was a normal life stage. I once drew pictures of myself at different stages of my life, in elementary school, in college, when I got my first job, when I got married, when I had children, when I had breast cancer, when I retired, and when I had grandchildren. Each of these events felt like normal milestones. Story 8. As a child, my mother would get angry at me for not taking care of myself and not cleaning around the house. However, she never taught me how to do any personal grooming, cleaning, or chores. She just expected me to figure it out on my own and would get upset if I didn't complete a task or did it incorrectly. Story 9. My mom was constantly cleaning. Once, I watched her give her friend a cup of coffee. She turned, wiped the counter, then took the coffee cup, emptied it, washed it, and put it away. The friend never even got to take a sip. She swept, mopped, and vacuumed daily, even checked under beds for dust. I realized years later that her behavior was a sign of my dad's abuse. He was awful. Story 10. My dad used to call me Cinderella, but with my real name for the first half. He thought it was the funniest joke because I wasn't actually his daughter. He adopted me when I was 2, and he never loved me like his real daughters. I was the literal red-headed stepchild no one wanted. He started calling me that after a big fight when I was 8, where he yelled at me that I wasn't even his, I was adopted. After that, he thought it was such a funny joke that he told it to everyone who came to our house and explained the entire story every time. It wasn't until years later that I realized none of the other adults laughed with him. I also think he completely missed the point of Cinderella. Story 11. Being left in a car for hours while my dad went to buy drugs. Nothing bad ever happened, but when I casually mention it to people, they treat me as if I was kept in a cage. It instantly reminds me that this is not a normal occurrence and was probably more dangerous than I perceived it to be. Story 12. At 4 years old, I was sent into a convenience store with a note to buy my mom's Lark cigarettes. I used the car lighter to start one by putting the filter to my lips, taking the lit lighter out, and inhaling a puff or two before handing it to her as she drove. She couldn't go inside because she had to stay in the car with my 2-year-old brother and was 8 months pregnant. Story 13. At the age of 8, I was cooking pancakes and eggs, changing diapers, and babysitting the baby for hours each day. I was raising myself and my brother, just as my sister had done for me. Story 14. When I was a little kid, I asked my dad for permission to do something he didn't want to agree to. Instead, he would pretend it was my mom asking and threaten to hit her for asking. It was his way of letting me know it was a no. I remember my brother crying because he received a bad grade, and my dad threatened to hit my mom as if she were the one who had received the low mark. My dad actually used this as an example for why such actions were necessary, and my brother never received a low mark again. Story 15. My mom was really big on always telling me the truth, and that sounds like a good and harmless thing. However, when there are no boundaries and heavy, difficult, painful, or scary information is shared with a 4-year-old without age-appropriate modifications or protections, it can be overwhelming. Story 16. When I was 8 or 9, my older male cousins would send me into the convenience store with money to buy whatever they wanted, because the clerk at the counter would always give me free items if I was alone. That person was arrested for being a child predator a few years into my teens. I'm lucky I never took him up on his offer of checking the back for more snacks. Story 17. Being told, "Go ahead and call the police. I'll beat you before they arrive. Then they can gladly take me to jail." I used to live in a remote area as a child. I would have been dead before they ever got there. I apologize for all the traumatic childhood memories this is bringing up. As a clear example of the situation, Story 18. My dad was a socially acceptable alcoholic. He earned 6 figures in the 1990s and was always out at dinners, functions, and VIP boxes at sports events, drinking expensive wine and champagne. This eventually led to him drinking bottles of expensive wine alone at night. He and my mom separated, leaving her with nothing as a single mother with 3 kids. I slept on the floor of my grandmother's spare bedroom without a mattress while my mom and little sisters had the bed. Eventually, she received a council house, which is government housing. Food banks weren't really known back then. At least I had never heard of them. My mom used to skip meals so we could eat while he was living it up. From the age of 12 to 16, I would skip the train fare to his place on Saturdays when he was at a VIP box for football or rugby. I would use my key to his house and take food. I'd load my bag with food, bring it back to my mom's house, and put it in the cupboard without telling her. Deep down, she must have known that this food kept appearing in her house, but I've never told her. I've shared this before as a funny story, usually with past partners when they asked why my dad and I don't get along, before I realized how troubling it was. They would look at me and say that it's not funny, it's horrible. So I don't mention it anymore. The rare times I spent with my dad usually ended with him passed out on the couch drunk, and I would have to be the adult, turn off the lights and TV, put his wine bottle and glass away, and so on. Eventually, she had the courage to divorce him and go to the child support agency, which enforces child support payments in the UK. I had aged out by then since I was over 18, but she received a couple of thousand a month from him for my sisters, if I recall. He was furious about having to pay. He passed away not long ago due to liver disease. To be honest, what hurt the most was that he got himself together when I was an adult, stopped drinking, became a better person, and was an incredible grandfather to my little niece. He spent every penny he had on her, and she absolutely adored him. I hated myself for being jealous that she got to have that as her grandfather while I just had a drunk alcoholic who left me sleeping on a floor. Story 19. I was arguing with my sister in the back seat of the car. My mother pulled over, made me get out, and drove away. I was alone under a highway overpass for about 10 minutes until they returned. I believe I was 9 years old. I do not trust my mother at all to this day, and I have some issues with abandonment. Story 20. My 8-year-old blonde crush from down the street taught me how to kiss when I was 6. It wasn't until recently that I wondered who had taught her. Story 21. When I was little, I would listen to music on the radio. I laid on my stomach on the floor of my room and stared at a small ball, daydreaming for hours at a time. I thought it was normal and that I was just poor and bored. Apparently, I was maladaptive daydreaming and dissociating from my traumatic life with formerly homeless and addicted parents. Story 22. Over the years, I developed the ability to numb out, space out, and forget things. This is apparently a trauma response. What is my trauma? Who knows? I was too busy numbing out and forgetting. Many of us share this ability to numb out and forget. Story 23. Getting hit by my dad for what, looking back, were symptoms of my attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I thought it was difficult back then too, but I believed it was normal. Well, apparently that is abuse. Story 24. When I was around 14, I was having an early coffee in the local park with my dad. As one of the waiters approached to bring the drinks, he said to my dad, "Ah, so this must be your mistress?" We laughed it off as a slightly weird joke, and my father explained that I was his daughter, after which the man apologized. I found the interaction a bit strange, but I didn't think much of it. Fast forward 4 years, and it turns out my dad has spent 15 years cheating on my mom with several relationships and affairs, as well as seeing hundreds, maybe even thousands, of escorts and prostitutes. He was quite close with that waiter and apparently sometimes brought the women to the cafe with him. Some of them were only a few years older than me. That's why the waiter assumed I was one of them. Story 25. I took care of my 3-year-old sibling all alone, feeding, bathing, and putting him down for naps when I was 8 years old while my parents were out working to support us. Story 26. When my grandma died, I was 15 and the baby of the family. She passed away in her own bed in her bedroom. There was such an influx of relatives over her last 48 hours that the house ran out of room, including air mattresses and couches. My uncle down the street similarly ran out of room. The only unoccupied room was Grandma's bedroom. The adults decided that I would sleep in there, believing that I was too young for it to affect me, even though the idea of sleeping on her bed in the room where she passed was unthinkable to them. I love telling this story and seeing people's reactions. It's so terrible that it's hilarious. Story 27. My parents implemented a do-over once when I was 13. We had been getting into many fights. They threatened to kick me out all the time, regularly called me derogatory names, and piled punishments and chores up to a year in advance. Mind you, this was all due to my struggle with the abuse they put me through and my inability to meet high expectations, especially when I hadn't been taught how to do much. They would get mad at me for not thinking critically, and would scream and berate me for hours without allowing me to sit, use the bathroom, or stop looking at them. They also made sure to have me repeat what they had just told me to ensure the hurtful things they said sunk in. After that, I would usually be sent to my room for the day or night and have all my privileges removed. No electronics, no art, no reading. I had nothing else to do, so I just had to stare at a wall. It wasn't bad for only a day or two, but it became a common punishment for me. At one point, they banned me from checking out books from my school library and started doing bag checks every day after school to make sure I wasn't sneaking books in. They put all the books I owned into the attic in boxes, threw my computer into the rain, took all my notebooks, read my diary, and made me write sentences all day every day for weeks. Usually, it was unnecessarily wordy ways of saying, "I won't disobey. I'll ask you for everything and I'm sorry." If I wasn't doing that, I was staring at a wall. This went on for years. Now that the context is out of the way, onto the do-over. The purpose of the do-over was to get rid of all my punishments, pretend nothing bad had ever happened, and just try to be a happy family. First, I was so excited. The idea of a do-over felt good. Not constantly being punished and having my parents be nice to me was refreshing. However, it backfired spectacularly within a few days because they immediately got angry at me again for forgetting a chore. They didn't even scream at me that time. They just made a disappointed face and told me how let down they were by my mistake, and how I would never get a do-over again because I didn't deserve it. After that, it was back to punishments, back to screaming, and back to threats of being kicked out and abandoned to my grandmother, who had abused me at a young age. For years, I was so angry and upset with myself for ruining what felt like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to not be a screw-up. That feeling has never gone away, and I only realized when I was 22 how damaging it was. I apologize for the length and intensity of my comment. Story 28. I grew up in a rural community with limited entertainment options. When we saw ambulances or smoke, my mom would take us in the car to investigate. I remember being very young and curious. It seemed exciting at the time, but now I find it perplexing. Thank goodness we never witnessed anything overly traumatic. I wouldn't expose my child to such experiences. Story 29. Our house sometimes lacked power or basic utilities because we were struggling financially. My mom would create games out of the situation and say we were camping. As a naive child, I didn't fully understand what was happening, but we weren't eating ramen noodles in the dark for fun. Oddly, those were the only moments when I felt a normal bond with my mom, as she was often quite abusive. Something about the situation made her calm. Story 30. Being praised for my slim body or adults commenting on it as if I weren't a young child had lasting effects as my body changed over the years. I struggled to accept myself for not being the same size as I was during my childhood. Story 31. Groundings meant I couldn't leave my room. My siblings couldn't talk to me, and I couldn't be part of any family functions, such as birthdays, graduations, or outings with my grandparents. I also couldn't eat meals with anyone else. Books became my escape. I was questioned every time I left my room to use the bathroom or get a glass of water. Sometimes my groundings included a chore, like doing the dishes or cleaning the bathrooms. Looking back, the punishments never fit the crimes. I was never out past curfew. In fact, I was rarely out at all. I had mediocre grades, but I wasn't a terrible student. When I tried to attend a dance with my boyfriend, my parents insisted I was trying to have sex with him and continued to guilt me into telling them everything that happened during the dance, or I would be grounded. This made me very sneaky with my text conversations. Hearing about how my other friends experienced groundings made me feel a little upset, and I promised myself I wouldn't do that to my own children. Story 32. I was hurt a lot as a kid. I thought all kids were rough and tumble and got into fights. Turns out I grew up in a very racist town. Other kids weren't afraid to go too far with weapons and violence. The police didn't seem to be above hurting a child. I have a detached retina, bone scars all over my face, torn cartilage in my ear, a broken nose, and chipped front teeth. I also have burn scars, skull fractures, and many broken bones. I didn't realize that other people didn't have that experience growing up. I guess I was in denial, but I thought these things just happened. Story 33. After I had my son, I gained over 12 kilograms in less than 2 weeks. Turns out my thyroid completely failed. Along with other health issues and extreme postpartum depression, I was not in a good place. My mother and aunt laughed and said things like, "Welcome to the club," and "We told you this would happen and you wouldn't be slim forever." The constant comments about how skinny I was and how one day you'll be overweight like us affected me deeply while I was growing up, and then I was mocked when it came true. It has taken me years to lose the weight and recover from postpartum depression. I'm still working on a healthy relationship with my body. Story 34. Seeing one parent for an hour between work and the bar. Seeing the other every other weekend. Buying cigarettes at 7 years old for the women in the neighborhood. Passing a beer to the driver because it is acceptable if it is only 3. Sitting on the floor of the cargo van because standing was dangerous. The deadbolts on the door used a key for both sides. Story 35. The array of empty beer cans and boxes of wine cluttered the kitchen counters. Looking back at old photos is somewhat shocking. Story 36. My sister and I would be seen but not heard and never wanted anything to eat or drink when offered while visiting others. All parents wanted their children to be like us. I realized later that this was trauma. We were minimizing ourselves, our wants, needs, and thoughts because we felt like a burden at home. Story 37. My sister and I had to leave the bedroom door open while we changed because our dad would get upset. Our mother would tell us that we made him feel like a stranger in his own home. He was abusive. Story 38. I had a garage refrigerator full of canned soda in nearly every brand and flavor, with no limitations on how many I could have. I hated water for much of my life and still struggle to drink it without adding flavoring. I am proud to say I haven't had a single soda in 3 years. Story 39. My dad acted like a kid himself. Everything was always hilarious, but he could flip like a switch too. His tantrums were legendary. Sometimes he would just leave or take my sister and me somewhere and never pick us up. Spontaneous trips were common, whether it was a middle-of-the-night drive or a trip to another state. I'm full of insane stories that were some of my happiest. As an adult, I'm learning that he had borderline personality disorder and was unmedicated. It's a challenge to look back on your happiest memories and realize there's now a taint to them. The worst is when I'm telling what I think is a funny little anecdote to people and they give me looks of pity. Sorry if I'm sharing too much. Story 40. My mom was in and out of prison when I was a young child, and my family tried to tell me she would go away because she was sick. Story 41. My parents told us to pack a bag so we could go to the orphanage because of our behavior. We would pack, and they would drive around town while we cried and begged to go home. This was a regular occurrence. Story 42. My mom used to hold my brother and me down and tickle us until we cried and begged her to stop. She said, "You're laughing, so you must like it." As a child, her being my mom made it hard for me to stand up for myself. Now, anytime someone tickles me, I just shut down or start crying or yelling after I catch my breath. That was an interesting conversation with my boyfriend. Story 43. My mom took me to Disneyland when I was 10. She bought me the best ticket package, gave me some money for food, and told me where and what time she would pick me up that night. Then I spent the entire day at Disneyland on my own. Story 44. My dad would threaten to send me to military school whenever he got mad at me when I was around 5 to 8 years old. He meant putting me away in a boarding school where I would be alone for a long time. One time, he even put me in the car and started driving. I screamed, cried, and pleaded until he turned around after a long time. I think that's why I'm incredibly scared of doing anything wrong now and tend to be a huge people pleaser. Story 45. When I was 8 years old, in the 1980s, I ran across the street one night to ask a neighbor how to scramble an egg because I was hungry. I had to do this because my dad and stepmother were gone for the weekend in another state on a road trip, and my 12-year-old stepsister, who was supposed to watch me, left for her friend's house, leaving me alone. Often left to my own devices, my family never locked any doors or windows. My parents were drug dealers. All of this seemed normal to me back then. Story 46. The one thing I genuinely didn't realize wasn't normal was that my parents used to make fun of me and mock me when I cried. They would imitate me and tell me I looked ugly and sounded stupid when I cried. I casually mentioned this to my husband in a joking manner, and he was so pained by it that he had to stop what he was doing to hug me. Story 47. When I was a child, my mother and I lived with my grandparents for a year. I discovered adult videos and responded to them as most do in my room. One night, I heard my grandfather's footsteps go from upstairs to downstairs outside my bedroom. He slowly creaked my door open. He looked at me with a chilling expression and said flatly, "I know what you do at night." Then, he closed my door and walked back upstairs. It really creeped me out at the time. I read into it in many ways and even disclosed my thoughts to a family member at one point, but they dismissed it as nothing. I didn't realize how thin the walls were in their house until much later, so I thought maybe that was his way of scaring me into stopping. Things seem normal between us today and in the past years. However, I still find it unsettling not knowing what he was trying to achieve with that interaction. He has said other strange things to me in the past, but I attributed it to my overthinking. Story 48. I would pretend to record my older brother and mother fighting. Like a movie, I could replay it again and again as a way of getting back at my brother. It doesn't make sense, I know. It turns out that this was actually a form of dissociating and removing myself from the verbal abuse I was witnessing. Story 49. My dad was a long-haul trucker, and my mom worked at a bar. When my dad was on the road and my mom had to work nights, she would put my sister and me, both about 6 and 7 years old, in our pajamas with toys and snacks and lock us in the car in the bar parking lot during her shift. Then she'd drive home and carry us to bed while we were sleeping. We had to get ourselves up and to school in the morning because she would be sleeping after her work. Story 50. My dad used to drive us to church on Sundays, and all of us kids would pile in the back of his pickup truck. Sometimes, for fun, he would cut through the bunny field on the way, and we would watch dozens of rabbits spring out of the way from the sides of the truck. We would laugh and shout for him to go faster. It took me years to realize we were harming countless rabbits, crushing entire nests of babies, while the mothers keeping them safe and warm barely escaped. Many animals were likely left to suffer slow and painful deaths because we thought it was entertaining to watch them desperately flee for their lives. Story 51. My mom insists that I should feel comfortable walking around the house naked because if I can't, it means I'm ashamed of my body. Story 52. When I was young, I felt very lonely, and my parents' response was, I was lonely when I was your age too, with not much else. After that, when I thought I was finally making friends, it turned out to be this incredibly troubled hypersexual kid who got expelled from school just 3 months later. Story 53. In kindergarten, we had a substitute teacher who announced that she would be staying as our teacher for the rest of the year. She was a really nice lady, and I liked her more, so I was happy. Years later, I found out that my actual teacher was out because she was being investigated for failing her duties as a mandated reporter. A girl in my class was apparently being abused by her father. They must have found it in her favor because she returned the following school year and stayed for several more until she retired. Story 54. When I was 15 in high school, I took a media studies class because the teacher was relaxed and we could goof off. There was a time when the teacher pulled me aside and gave me an Andy Warhol film to watch on a VHS tape. I can't remember the title, but it seemed very 70s. The opening scene featured a man inappropriately engaging with a woman on a couch. I have never moved so quickly in my life. My parents were in the next room and somehow didn't see or hear anything. I swiftly took out the tape and put it back in my school bag. The next day, I gave the tape to a friend, saying something like, Mr. M gave this to me. It's kind of weird. A few days later, the teacher approached me, extremely upset that I had given that movie to another student. I don't recall his exact words, but he said things like, it was only meant for me, and I shouldn't have shown that to the other student. It wasn't until after I left school that I realized how inappropriate that was. I didn't dwell on it much as a teenager, but it was quite disturbing. Story 55. When I was a kid, my dad told me and both my siblings a story called The Grasshopper and the Ant. It's a fable, but no one else seems to know it when I mention the story. The simplest retelling is that the grasshopper and ant lived in the same part of the forest. All summer, the grasshopper played his fiddle and enjoyed the sun. Meanwhile, the ant worked hard all summer to store food and firewood for winter. He told the grasshopper repeatedly, if you don't do something now, you'll starve and freeze. But the grasshopper didn't worry. Then came winter. The ant was warm and snug in his hideaway with plenty of food when he heard a terrible knocking on the door. He opened it to find the grasshopper, standing in the snow, half frozen. The grasshopper begged for a place to stay and food for the winter. The ant was right, he was dying outside. The ant reluctantly agreed to let him spend the winter, and the grasshopper fiddled their winter away. My father always ended this story by looking us in the eye and saying, and you're the ant. In my case, he told my older sibling they were the grasshopper. And to this day, one of their online bios reads, always the grasshopper, never the ant. Looking back, I cannot imagine why he would have told any of his kids that they were doomed to always need the charity of others to figure their life out or that they would always be stuck taking in or fixing things for other people. 7-year-old me really took that story to heart. Story 56. My stepdad has been bullying my mother. I thought that was how relationships worked for years. Husbands abused their wives, and it felt like the way of the world. I still can't wrap my head around it, and I'm 36. Story 57. I'm reading this for ideas. It's hard to remember all the things because there were so many. At the time, I knew they weren't harmless, like a deep knowledge. But I didn't have the words to explain why. I knew what a normal family should look like by watching shows like Full House and Family Matters. One thing I haven't seen mentioned yet is that my dad would visit churches like other people visit museums. He just loved the spectacle Russian Orthodox, black churches, super conservative Pentecostal, primitive Baptist, etc. He would find something he liked, go for a while, then have a problem, and we would move on. He'd talk about how crazy some of them were with glee. I was supposed to take the Christian faith seriously, and he demanded it, but I could tell he had no real convictions or roots. It's as if he was looking for the perfect set of rules that would make him feel whole. Story 58. When my uncle would give me a ride, he would let me hold the steering wheel in his pickup truck while he opened another beer. Story 59. I attended summer school one year in the 7th grade. The school was across town, and I walked alone on the first day. There was a girl I knew who lived not too far from me. She showed me how to hitchhike. Some days she didn't go to school, so I hitchhiked alone. All those who gave us rides were men, and only once, when we were together, did someone say something inappropriate. He pulled up to the school, and as we reached for the door handles, he said, "Do you know what a pimp is?" I replied, "No." My friend, who was in the front seat, said, "Yes." He held out a $100 bill and offered it to us, saying we should think about all the clothes and shoes we could buy. We both declined and thanked him for the ride. We exited the car and went to class. When I look back, it was 1968 and we were fortunate. It was a time when we walked everywhere. Story 60. My ex's parents made his 8-year-old brother pack a suitcase, put him in the car, drove him to a group home for troubled youth, and forced him out of the car. They only revealed the truth when he started sobbing so loudly that people nearby took notice. They shared this story at every Christmas gathering. Story 61. My brother and I would pick up used chewing gum from the sidewalk and chew it in the 1980s. I told our older sister a month ago, and she was disgusted. Story 62. My mom led me to believe during a large portion of my childhood that we had cameras and listening devices in our home. I had previously been temporarily taken away by Child Protective Services, and she convinced me that I would be taken from my bed in the middle of the night for not going to sleep on time. I believe this heavily influenced how I felt about myself, and I still struggle at nearly 30 to believe that I'm allowed to take up space and make a little noise without anything bad happening as a result. Story 63. My best friend's stepfather would always sniff her underwear before putting it in the washing machine. She wouldn't do it to her brother's undergarments. I was about 9 or 10 years old when I saw that. Story 64. When I was a kid, my mom looked after a couple of her friends' children pretty regularly for extra cash, since she didn't work at the time. One boy she watched several days a week from when he was an infant to about 3 years old, and there were a couple of other infants and toddlers around regularly. Looking back, I am certain none of their mothers knew that my mom left for hours at a time every day and had me taking care of them. She would just go get lunch, run errands, or whatever, and I was in charge of the baby's feedings, diapers, and whatever they needed. I am glad no emergencies ever happened because this was before cell phones, and I was definitely unaware of any emergency protocols. I was also supposed to be homeschooled at the time, but the only thing I remember was my mom leaving me with a cassette player and a big plastic binder full of reading tapes so I would learn to read. Story 65. My mom never allowed me to have junk food at home. When I was around 10, my parents got divorced and she started going on dates. On her date nights, she would let me have a bag of chips, but only if I ate them in my closet while she left for her date. I realized that she couldn't afford a babysitter. She knew I would be fine by myself, but she didn't want her date to know that she was leaving her young child home alone. I was told I could leave the closet when I finished the bag of chips. Then I was home alone watching TV or playing The Sims. I never thought much about this until I told the story to a friend years later, and he looked at me in disbelief. Story 66. When I fell asleep in the car during rides home, my parents would leave me in the car. I have vivid memories of waking up feeling hot and sweaty and having difficulty unbuckling the seatbelt because it was too hot to the touch. Story 67. I thought my grandfather was just playing chase, but in hindsight, he was extremely intoxicated and trying to confront us. Story 68. Not being able to have any say in how I dressed or anything regarding my appearance, my family had absolute control over how I looked. I recently discovered they were trying to make me look as unappealing as possible. Story 69. My father was not present much during the first 10 years of my life, so after my mother passed away, I moved in with him and his new family. Our bonding ritual became my learning to make his after-work drink. A perfect Manhattan with a twist of lemon. It took me about a week to get all the measurements right and about a year and a half before my stepmother realized what I had been doing. I was grounded for 6 months because I should have known better than to play with alcohol. Story 70. When I was around 13, my parents decided to kick my brother out of his room to rent the basement. I offered him my room and moved into the hallway closet. I felt proud of this decision at the time, but looking back, it was a sign of deeper issues that my family allowed me to move into a space that barely accommodated my bed. I still struggle with feeling obligated to sacrifice myself. Story 71. Not me, but my younger brother. When he was around 9 or 10, he misbehaved too many times, and my mom told him to pack everything he owned. He wasn't allowed to pack clothes or food because our mom owned all that. So he packed anything he had ever bought with pocket money or won at arcade games and got in the car. My mom drove to the nearest county road and told him to get out and have a nice life. My little brother, who may have been quite naive, had a complete breakdown, promising he would be good from then on. Once my mom was satisfied with how much he cried, she shut the door and took us home. She thinks it's a hilarious story. I'm waiting to see if it comes up at his wedding this summer. Story 72. As kids, our neighbors had children around the same age as us, but a couple of years older. Every other month, these two children brought home a new pet: a dog, a cat, an aquarium, hamsters, hedgehogs, and so on. They would always show us the new pet. My sister and I would say, "Wow, your house is full of animals." They looked at us with blank expressions. It turned out these animals were all dying after a couple of months, and in some cases, weeks. The family moved away when we were about 12. I recently learned that one of them was convicted of murdering his pregnant girlfriend a couple of years ago. Story 73. Not a story from my own childhood, which was fairly normal with a few dysfunctional family members drifting in and out, but from a few years after marrying my husband. One time, he told me, "I didn't actually realize how strange my childhood was until we started dating. I would be telling a story and laughing, and I'd see the look of horror on your face." 17 years later, with 3 kids of our own, he definitely understands how troubled some of his experiences were. Story 74. A few years ago, I was talking to a friend about how I would go to my dad's house every other weekend, as per the custody agreement, and clean everything. Instead of laughing with me, he had a serious expression and said, "I'm sorry, that wasn't even one of the bad things." Felt a bit polarizing. I still don't know what's normal because I feel like that's not even bad. Story 75. When you started developing breasts and having them pinched by friends and family, young and old, while calling you Dolly Jr. after Dolly Parton. Story 76. My mom used to give me the silent treatment whenever she was upset with me, sometimes for days. Even when I was in the right, I still had to apologize or she would continue to ignore me. It wasn't until my 20s or 30s that I realized most mothers do not behave that way. I now have borderline personality disorder. Go figure. Story 77. My dad took me with him to the pub when I was 7. I got a Coke and peanuts and was happy. I was a well-behaved, calm, easygoing kid. I could sit still for hours. It wasn't a family-friendly pub. It was a place for drinkers. I realized much later that he only took me because he couldn't leave me at home and wanted a drink. For a long time, I thought it was a nice thing between us. Story 78. My entire childhood was chaotic. My mom would often gather us in the car or a friend's car and take us on vacations to different states and once to Canada. She was keeping us away from Child Protective Services. We were finally picked up at school on April Fool's Day. Story 79. My first experience with fan fiction was when I was 10 years old. I was browsing through various fan edits with different text colors for each character on YouTube. I stumbled upon one that was an explicit story depicting Draco Malfoy violently assaulting Hermione, uploaded like one of those AskReddit style videos. Looking back on it now, I realize it significantly affected my perspectives on sexuality, and not in a positive way. Story 80. The lack of memory speaks volumes. I have very few memories, yet so many people, including family and friends, have many of me. They often hold me in high regard and with love. I have no idea what they are talking about, and it can hurt feelings because they remember those memories so fondly. Feels like a blank for me. I no longer talk to anyone. A profound isolation. Story 81. My mom took me camping once. She had been camping at our property for a week during summer. I remember when she came back and said we were going camping. The property was about 4 hours away. When we got there, we stopped by the side of the road and picked some blackberries. I remember she was picking berries near a dead deer. I asked her how the deer died, and she said it must have been hit by a car and then stumbled. It seemed reasonable at the time. The next day, my mom got up early and made me blackberry pancakes. My mother has only made breakfast twice in my lifetime. She didn't eat any of the blackberries on her pancakes. I immediately broke out in a rash and became hot. Then I became delirious and lost consciousness. I woke up screaming and begging for help. She told me that I had chicken pox. The next day, some campers stopped by and asked what was wrong with me. I heard one of them say they hoped I hadn't picked any blackberries because they were sprayed with poison pesticide. My mom immediately packed everything up and drove past at least 4 hospitals. We never talked about it again. My pediatrician was never informed, but afterwards, I had problems in school. The letters of the alphabet looked backwards and forwards, making school harder. Story 82. There were neighbors and teachers who everyone said were peculiar and to stay away from. It was generally accepted that they could continue in society as long as you kept your children away from them. I never thought much about it until I was grown up. Story 83. My parents barely talked to each other, had separate bedrooms, and there was the whole issue of child abuse. I only realized how wrong it was when my mother hit me in front of another child who was visiting us, and the boy was absolutely horrified. When I visited a friend from kindergarten, she did something wrong, and I was astonished that her mother calmly explained to her what she had done and how to avoid it in the future. It really struck me how bad every single detail was when I was 19 and spent a lot of time with my boyfriend's parents, who were great people, even though he often behaved poorly. Story 84. When I told my mother that other children were bullying me, she replied, "What did you do to deserve it?" When I said, "Nothing," she scoffed and replied, "They must have a good reason." Then she did nothing to stop the bullying. This was the same woman who bullied me every time I exhibited my autistic traits, so I am not surprised by her response. Story 85. My pediatrician performed a pelvic exam during a physical examination when I was 10 years old, and my father was present in the room. Story 86. This experience seemed harmless from my perspective at the time, but now I recognize how deeply inappropriate it was. My friend's mother took a real interest in me while I was growing up. I knew her from age 13 to 16. I had been abused as a child and was starved for attention from adults, so I leaned into this relationship. We began texting outside of my visits with my friend, and she started flirting with me. This progressed to us having phone conversations of a sexual nature and exchanging pictures. This woman was at least 40 years old when I was just 14. I grew up and came to understand how wrong that situation truly was. Story 87. So my parents' first place in the United States was a comfortable, nice-sized house in Orange County. The kids in the neighborhood and I used to ride bikes and play ball, but the house next to us was eerily quiet and almost seemed abandoned. We often played basketball in the small alley of our house and would occasionally peer through the fence. One time, a Korean woman greeted us from there, and she was really friendly, but other than that, the house seemed creepily empty. My neighbors would sometimes joke that strange things were happening inside, but none of us really took it seriously. Eventually, my family moved to another place. Later, I asked my mom about the house and the neighbors, and she told us the truth. It was owned by a decent Korean-American family whose daughter was suffering from demonic possession. The reason it was quiet was that the family would either take the daughter to church or invite pastors and exorcists inside. My mom added that the girl's mother came over one time and told her not to worry if she heard loud noises, which is incredibly unsettling in retrospect. Now, I don't believe in exorcism, but my mom said it with such a serious tone that I couldn't help but believe her. Supernatural or not, it's pretty messed up that I practically spent my entire elementary school years living next to a house with demons, or realistically, a mentally abused girl. Story 88. I waited in the car for my dad to finish his errands, reading through the car manual to pass the time. He was at the pub and left me in the parking lot for a couple of hours. Story 89. Making friends with the random adults in the bar. Sleeping in their cars while my mother was inside. Getting picked up from school by these people when my mother forgot to pick me up because she was drunk. I thought it was fun and that these people were really my aunts and uncles until I was about 15. Story 90. Having 2 friends in the 1980s with the nicknames George and Jungle never led anyone to think those names were racist. They were our friends and were treated no differently than anyone else in the group. Story 91. You're not hungry. You're thirsty. Go drink some water and the pains will go away. We didn't have a lot of food in the house. It took me years to realize I had been advised to keep my stomach feeling full, even if it was just with water. Story 92. I cannot remember where we sat to eat. I cannot recall which room or the table. Not one memory. I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't know if it's related to that, but I remember everything else about the house we lived in. Story 93. My stepdad taught me a nursery rhyme when I was 8. Suffocation, we love suffocation. Suffocation, the game we love to play. First, you take a plastic bag. Then you take a rubber band. Over the head. Now you're dead. La 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 la. Story 94. My sister was diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 4, and I, at 7 years old, was told that it was my responsibility to make sure she was okay. Story 95. My mother used to have me come to her smoking spot in the house for gossip time, which actually meant I would watch her get blackout drunk, experience secondhand smoke, and then she would offer me cigarettes or alcohol to keep me around. I thought it was cool that I was so mature for my age, but now I could never imagine doing that to my own child. After a certain point in the night, she would just pass out, and I would have to prevent her from hurting her head, then drag her to a safe spot, lift her onto the bed, or make a nest for her with pillows to keep her rolled on her side. Story 96. I baked all the birthday cakes, including my own, from around the age of 12. I also went shopping with my mom for birthdays and holidays to choose presents for everyone, including myself, and then wrapped all the gifts from about the same age. Nobody has ever baked a birthday cake for me. I've had cakes baked by others in my adult life, but my birthday was close to my ex's, so we always celebrated together. Cake and food were never for me. They were for the guests. I want one birthday where I get to have my favorite cake. Story 97. All of my cousins and schoolmates would always pick on me and make fun of me, calling me an outsider. I never knew why until recently. I found out that the person I thought was my real dad isn't. Everyone else knew except me while I was growing up. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.